Well, I bought it. I said I wasn't going to, but the hype or curiosity or straight up masochism eventually wore me down. After calling Nightreign mod slop and claiming that it wouldn't be a game I'm interested in, I caved and purchased it. And after beating the game, the questions I'm left to answer are, is Nightreign more than just a shameless cash grab? Does it offer an engaging challenge for experienced players? And to summarize, was I wrong about Nightreign? Yeah, I was wrong. I'm wrong about everything. Just ask my comment sections, you fucking assholes. Now I want to be upfront about one thing, and say that for the sake of this video, I will not be looking at this product as anything more than the product itself. I'm not going to comment on my feelings about the ethical concerns I have in regards to this game being what I call a copy-paste game. And I won't be commenting on how this title reflects a tonal quality shift in FromSoft's development style. I've already said what I have to say about that within my last Nightreign video, and so I'll be looking at this game purely from the lens of the content itself. So to begin our analysis of Nightreign, we need to start by framing it within its two game modes. Let's start with the co-op gameplay. What we can assume is the intended experience that a ton of gameplay elements were designed around. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that there is a stark contrast in co-op gameplay between a good run, where everything just happens to work out for you. You get all the flask charges, you get a high-level weapon, you make a lot of runes, your teammates are there with you, helping you fight along the way, and you all make it safely into zone every time, and successfully beat the bosses. But there is a stark contrast between that and the awkward runs, which happen frequently within co-op runs. I wasn't able to beat the first night boss on the first day I played this game, even though I had beat him several times within the network test, because there was a bunch of beginners just getting the hang of the game, and they were frequently causing awkward runs, in which your team is not sticking together, not following pings, dying and losing souls, fighting mini-bosses alone and only one person gets the drop, the ultimate result of which is often players will leave games that they think are just not redeemable. If they've lost enough ground that the final boss is basically a lost cause, if they don't believe in their teammates based on what they've seen within the first few rounds, then people will just leave. And if one person leaves and you're 3 solo players playing co-op, then likely the second person will leave as well, and so you're left with a tanked run that you're just going to leave as well. If you wanted to play solo, you would just queue solo. Me and Booty Juice had just played a match yesterday where we traveled across the map grabbing every flask before committing to any boss and earning souls and levels. This is something that our teammate was not aware of, and instead he thought we were just fucking around sightseeing. And so by first boss, at which point I had a purple weapon that I upgraded with stones, and a maxed out flask, and easily enough levels to take out the first boss, our third left because he thought we were just throwing, and didn't want to waste his time. On that run, me and Booty Juice decided to just go with it, and we made it to Sentient Pest and got him down to a sliver of health before we both died, because we fucking suck. With our third, we definitely would have had it. And honestly, if we were just slightly better at the fight, had more knowledge about the fight, we would have had it. And that leads me to another huge complaint that many people have complained about in the past. Why the fuck is there no duos in this goddamn co-op game? Especially when your third can just leave and you'll just be playing the game duos anyway. Like, it's perfectly doable without even a single balance patch to just let you queue into the 3-man mode as a duo. In fact, it would probably be memed as the real challenge run and the real way to play the game because of its difficulty. Instead, it's just not an option, and I don't know why. We were complaining about this at the network test. We all knew it was a terrible decision not to be included in the co-op game, but for some reason it's got to be like patched in later, hopefully. I don't know. Maybe by the time you're watching this, it already has been, but it is absolutely absurd that this mechanic is lacking from the game. But this is kind of just the tip of the co-op iceberg as far as lacking mechanics. This game features no crossplay, and it features no in-game party chat, to a point where if I was playing with people who had issues, they would just be sending me messages through Xbox, which is not convenient at all when this game is on the clock. I don't have time to be checking messages to see what's going on with my teammates. And also, on top of that, there are matchmaking issues, where sometimes match-made queues are taking upwards of 5 to 10 minutes, which makes no sense at all. It's not like there's skill-based matchmaking to take into account, it's purely based on which map you're running. And I have a hard time believing that with nearly 3 million players, that it takes 5 minutes to find one solo to add to our team. And with all these issues in mind as a jumping off point, I can begin to explain my total analysis of Nightreign, which is that it is a game absolutely chopped full of massive contradictions within its core design philosophy that end up in a constant state of conflict with one another. One of which is that it was built from the ground up to be a co-op game, yet fails to implement the expected features of a modern co-op game. And on top of that, all of the remaining co-op features, which make up the skeleton of this game, end up in conflict with its other game mode, solo mode, which I'm happy to say works surprisingly well despite that contradiction. And I say that both before and after the patch that came out this morning, which gave a free revive to solo players at every boss fight, both the End Knight boss fights and the Night Lord fight, and also increased the amount of rune acquisition players would get when playing solo. Now, as far as the free revive mechanic goes, it's definitely generous, I would argue almost overly so, but I'm not exactly upset about it. I was able to beat half this game before the patch and half after, and within that first half of the game I played solo pre-patch, I found that the resurrection items you can buy at merchants were more than enough to struggle through, even if that took a lot of struggling. It was pretty satisfying because it was challenging. The rune boost I do find to be really unnecessary. Pre-patch, I was able to hit max level several times, and past that point, runes become kind of unnecessary. There was a run I ran where I was able to get 200,000 bonus runes past max level and purchasing everything I could carry, and that was due to a specific mechanic that was going on, but still, there's clearly a margin for error where after a certain point your runes are just going to be pointless. And again, I'm not exactly upset about them making the game easier. I know a lot of people were having a hard time with it, and I could go either way with it, but personally I felt like it was better beforehand. Overall, this patch was nice, and I do think patched some holes in the solo gameplay, but I do wish that there was an option to turn this patch off and create a challenge run that would potentially reward you with better rewards if you were to complete it. More merc, higher tier stones, something along those lines. I would even go as far as to say that they should have a permadeath mode that doesn't have any of the resurrection items that once completed could be seen as the ultimate mastery of this game. Because overall, solo mode is the challenge mode that makes Nightreign worth playing for experienced players. You're on your own against many base game enemies, and you have to choose which routes you're going to take, which items you want, and just how much you want to commit to any one fight before the storm might get you. You have to trust in your own abilities and evaluate how well you're going to be able to take on challenges and how quickly, without having to rely on a bunch of teammates who you don't know if you can rely on or not. A lot of these higher tier boss fights within the co-op game take too long and have far too much health to solo within an effective amount of time, and as well as that, if your teammates aren't going to gather the rewards you would obtain after the boss fight, then it's just a waste of everyone's time. In solo mode, you're never faced with that as a potential point of failure. Instead, it's purely your skill and your skill alone that decides whether or not you succeed in different fights, if you beat them within the time period allotted. Having the ability to know your own strengths and weaknesses and know which fights that you're good at and that you can succeed efficiently with, and apply that in practice within a run of Nightreign, is the most satisfying experience I've had throughout my gameplay of this whole game. It is very rewarding from the standpoint of an experienced Elden Ring player to see a base game Elden Ring boss that you know you can crush easily, and to know that you're going to get a huge bonus in time and runes and potential rewards, and a huge boon to your overall run based on your previously acquired skill and information about these bosses. Really, the quality of Elden Ring's base game bosses are a foundational pillar which Nightreign sits upon, to a point where there's several Nightreign bosses that are frequently used as mini bosses across the map that made me realize just how little experience I had with them, such as the Bell-Bearing Knights, which are optional to a point where I've rarely fought them at all. And so one of the good things I can say about Nightreign is it just made me really look back and appreciate how good Elden Ring is. But on top of that, there are some small changes that they've made to some of the bosses in base game Elden Ring. such as the Grafted Monarch fight, a modified version of Godric, who only really gets a handful of moves based on Crucible traits, I believe, but they are pretty cool for a mini-boss at the end of a night. Now there's one other change to the boss formula that Nightreign pulls off that I see as a massive innovation on the Souls formula, and something that I will give infinite praise for. That being the grab move mechanic that they've implemented into every enemy in the game that previously had a non-telegraphed grab. Grabs have basically never had a real telegraph distinguishing them from other attacks. You just end up taking the hit and enter an animation, take the damage, and deal with it. However, Nightreign flips this formula, making it so that the grab moves aren't just incredibly powerful, low telegraph moves, but instead adds this strange electric effect and sound effect to the grab moves to signify their coming. And alongside that, they've reprised the Makiri counter, kind of, from Sekiro, allowing a system where if you time your dodge perfectly with the grab move and dodge into it, you do something. I don't know exactly what it does. I believe it increases the amount of posture damage you deal to the boss or something like that. I'm sure it's doing something good. Bottom line is, it is a benefit for engaging with the boss fight. It is a benefit for knowing the bosses well, and it is a feature that no other Souls game can really claim it had done. Sure, Makiri counters existed, but there were still grab moves in Sekiro. And in Sekiro, often the grab move is treated just like a grab move in any other Dark Souls game, where you're only really supposed to just avoid it. Oftentimes you would just sprint away from it. In this case, throughout the entirety of Nightreign, there is one extra combat feature compared to any other Souls game, improving the total combat sandbox. That is absolutely not something I was expecting to say about the copy and paste game. It's kind of wild, honestly, and I really hope that this feature is recognized for how great it is and is implemented into every Souls game from now on, just like I hope every Souls game has jump attacks from now on. The bottom line is, even if you hate Nightreign, even if you think it's a terrible product, terrible game, something that you wish didn't exist, this feature alone is valuable, and you should appreciate that, while still shitting on everything else. Now, the last boss-related aspect of this game are the reprisals of many Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 bosses. Which, yeah, fuck with the immersion of everything in the Souls games and Elden Ring, but it's kind of just fun, I don't know. I don't really take this game all that seriously lore-wise. Maybe it's upsetting to the lore guys, but I don't really mind. And the thing is, a lot of these fights are easy. Easier than you would expect them to be when they were a significant challenge in their base game most of the time. While that's funny to look back on and think, wow, we've come so far from simple boss fights, the simplicity of these boss fights really fits well with what they're attempting to do here. All of these boss fights take place within end-of-night fights, which means they're not truly boss fights, but instead they're just one step on the path towards the Night Lord. In a way, it's weighted towards your success on that fight. You're supposed to be able to beat them, even if failure is an option. They're not one independent boss fight that needs to be hard on its own. They're one piece of your total run, which is leading towards the real meat of Nightreign and the core fundamental draw of the game that really defines its success are the Night Lord fights. Unfortunately, however, I would say that there isn't a single high-quality Elden Ring boss fight amongst all of them, and it'll take a minute to explain what I mean by that. You see, there's a large contradiction in their design philosophy that takes place between their difficulty and their place at the end of the run, at the end of a 40-minute run. That difficulty has to be tempered by something to make these fights an acceptable challenge that you might risk 40 minutes of your life for a single attempt that could end quite quickly. And so how do they solve for this? Well, by having incredibly simplistic movesets that are all really cinematic. The Night Lord fights end up being this huge spectacle, but ultimately, the devs could only balance that grandiose nature against the massive runback by having incredibly simple movesets. You see, while attempting to defeat the Gaping Jaw for the first time, I realized I was going to have an insanely difficult time remembering any of his moves and the timings for them, based on one 5-minute attempt every 40 minutes or so. It's kind of weird to expect your players to be able to learn these fights well, given the limited experience you'd have with these bosses even after hours and hours of gameplay. But you see, where my circumstances allowed for a massive benefit on this fight wasn't due to skill or knowledge. I had one factor that was working in my favor, and that was I was recording. I had footage of my run, and I could just look back and see what the different moves were. And in doing so, I isolated each move within a film clip and then edited them together to have a compilation of his entire moveset. So that way I could look at my footage whenever I needed a refresher on his moves without having to learn his moveset on the fly in the heat of battle. This was a massive benefit to me, and I highly recommend that you just look up guides for these bosses, rather than wasting tons of your life if you're not really that interested in failing runs over and over. I have a bunch of footage, and I could make guides myself if anyone was interested, so let me know. But it is a weird precedent to set. A lot of players, such as myself, like the process of learning bosses. I always say I spent 40 hours the first time I played Millennia because I wanted to learn her well, not just beat her. But in Nightreign, that same 40 hours would be the equivalent of like 50 attempts on the boss. Luckily for me, however, I had my footage to look back on, which means those same 50 attempts worth of information were at my fingertips. I could just watch it 50 times. But unfortunately, what this process revealed to me is just how simple these boss fights are. Gaping Jaw is a boss I struggled with quite a bit, but it turned out he only had 12 moves, which is 2 less moves than a Crucible Knight. That's also 4 less moves than Godric, the first demigod boss in Elden Ring, 9 less moves than Morgott, who is a mid-game demigod boss, and yet 12 moves is the same amount as the mini-boss Ulcerated Tree Spirit. After this, I did the same thing with some other footage I had and found that Libra has 13 moves, and so does Gladius, and Caligo even only has 11 moves, which is 5 less than Agheel, the first dragon in Elden Ring. All of the Night Lords seem to be in the low teens, which is an absurd lack of move complexity within a modern Souls game. And honestly, the best comparison I can make between the Night Lords and anything we've previously seen in Souls is the fucking Bed of Chaos, a simple fight with highly punishing moves and an insane run back, except this time it's tenfold. And while I do think pointing that out is kind of an interesting thought process, I don't want to be the guy who's saying that these Night Lord fights are like the Bed of Chaos. Bed of Chaos fucking blows. I think it's more appropriate to look at the Night Lord fights in one of 2 ways. Either you can just see them as bad bosses and move on with your life. They're simplistic, they're basically mini-bosses, but scaled up and given giant AoEs, and so that's perfectly understandable if you just want to call it a day and move on with your life. They're bad, and that's fine. Or you can take into account the circumstances of the whole run, and realize that the entire run is one unit of challenge, with many individual pieces that build to it, which I think is a healthier way to look at these fights, and not look at the Night Lords as Souls bosses in the traditional sense, but more like one last enemy between you and your victory after nearly an hour of gameplay. And to me, it's a little of column A, little column B. I define it more as a spectrum depending on how good the boss itself is. I think the Augur is really bad and doesn't deserve its place at the end of the run. It's definitely something we can look at and just say that's a bad boss. The experience sucks and it's really boring, but you know, it looks good, I guess. It's the kind of one saving grace. But something like the Night Lord is such a good mini-boss fight and technically works well enough that I really wish they would reskin his moveset and put him as a mini-boss in any other project they might be working on. Give it the old Nightreign treatment and reuse it somewhere else. And I could say the same of pretty much the rest of the Night Lord bosses. Almost especially so because if they were smaller and if they were lower stakes and if they were optional, they would find their places in the world a lot more succinctly. I always say an optional fight gets more leniency because we all kind of jive with different boss fights in different ways, depending on our playstyles and skills and strengths and weaknesses. And so a sloppier fight, when made optional, could be something that a player with high health and a shield who doesn't give a fuck about dodging and perfecting the fight can just crush with ease, and if it's a valuable source of souls or a good weapon, it could be valuable to that person. And I do think the Night Lord assets are polished enough that they could work really well in other circumstances. Even if I think they're kind of bad or lesser than a real fight, especially so if they were expanded upon to have even more in-depth movesets. But that's the thing, I'm kind of put into a weird position here because ordinarily I would no-hit a boss before I even decided to talk about it. I would want to understand it on a super deep level and come to terms with its faults and strengths in the most extreme form. But that's not exactly something you can do with the Night Lord fights. I do think it's worth understanding that this game isn't a traditional Souls game, and to be fair to the assets, we have to take into account the circumstances they reside in. The Night Lord bosses are inconvenient to reach beyond reason. You're not supposed to be perfect at them. You're not supposed to know their entire movesets. You're just supposed to beat them. They're made to be fought sloppily, and so I can only really hold them up to that standard. But that in itself is a bit of a condemnation if you ask me. Less of the bosses, but of the philosophy behind the boss design. When you really break it down, we're fighting through 40 minutes of preparation just to fight an enemy with the technical depth of a mini-boss, albeit with an insane degree of spectacle to them. Now, another aspect of contradiction within the Night Lord's designs comes down to how they play against 3 players at once, and how they can remain a substantial threat against 3 players at once without upsetting the balance of difficulty versus a 40-minute runback. And where that contradiction was resolved through simplistic movesets, this contradiction is solved through insane massive AoEs or gank. And the bottom line is, if that seems off-putting to you, then Nightreign is definitely not the game for you. Every Night Lord boss has at least one move or aspect that makes it this messy slop of explosions on your screen, or swarm of enemies. Libra becomes a bullet hell at times, and reminds me of some sort of Diablo 4 fight. Adele has his massive AoEs that spawn as after effects on his head slams, which I will note are a jumpable move, and I really appreciate that. It's kind of like a delayed version of Godfrey's stomp attacks, covering nearly the entire arena, but giving you multiple ways of avoiding it. Caligo has his Sky Freeze attack, which seems to cover the entire arena into one giant AoE. As well as that, he often spawns a bunch of ice mines everywhere that you could potentially walk into and take frostbite. Fulgor leaves trails of holy damage behind him, and the Night Lord gets elementally buffed after effects on some of his bigger moves, reminiscent of promised consort Radahn. Gladius has his split mechanic to add gank, Gnoster starts with gank and then combines, and the Augur has the sleep nuke, jellyfish adds, and arena trap and enemy arms. Honestly, a really garbage fucking fight. And while I criticize the sloppiness, especially when it muddies the water of telegraphs within fights with insane runbacks, I think the majority of these moves are simple enough to get the hang of and avoid consistently after 3 or 4 attempts. You know, multiple hours of your life. However, despite the difficulty and the field-spanning moves, I actually managed to beat Augur and Caligo on my first attempt, and that's also while solo. It seems they've implemented enough training wheels into the game that can catch you if you fall, especially now with the solo buff, that you can kind of struggle through most fights without learning them so well. Honestly, the Night Lord fights worked a lot better than they thought they would. The good ones are pretty good, and the bad ones are just kind of annoying. Now lastly, I want to talk about the Night Lord's weakness mechanic, which is a pretty interesting way to counter their more powerful moves, which you can stagger them out of with their weakness. Each Night Lord has one specific elemental weakness, and if you can manage to find a source of it, you'll be at a significant advantage by the time the final fight rolls around. And that's something I can appreciate quite a bit. One of my favorite builds in DS3 was a Faith Dexterity build, where I had collected every elemental infusion buff that I could, and then I could get an extra bit of damage corresponding to the boss's weaknesses in DS3, which are a lot more passive and don't really give you that much more damage, especially with the investment involved, but it is a fun little way to play, and this kind of mirrors that. However, the random nature of the way the game plays out means that you can never really prepare for a fight. Of course, you could attempt to hit up the different compounds that have elemental types to them and hope you get a weapon that would apply, but there's no guarantee that it's going to drop a weapon, nonetheless one that your character would be effective with. And sure, if you had the runestones available that would allow you to start with an elementally fused weapon that was corresponding to the boss's weakness, you could then upgrade your weapon with stones, but obtaining those runestones are also random. I was never able to use Holy on the Night Lord's fight in any of my attempts. I never found a Holy weapon. And even at that point in the game, that far in, I didn't have a runestone that would give me a Holy weapon to start with. so I still don't know how that fight would play out with his weakness. All I could really do was cross my fingers and hope that I obtained a holy weapon, because this game is a... Can I just say that I fucking hate the term roguelike? It didn't used to be that games needed to be defined this way. They used to just be kind of random and were good enough that they had a lot of replayability. And that's really all there is to it. Like, that doesn't need a term. Nobody was calling Left 4 Dead a roguelike just because it had random elements and random enemy spawns and different weapons in different places. It was just a good game and we liked it, so we played it. I think in modern times, game developers have taken this as a catch-all. If they just add some sort of random nature to their game, the players are forced to play it forever. And that's sort of an implication with a lot of these modern games. Nightreign seems to be designed as though you're going to play it 1,000 times. But I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's earned that yet. And a lot of that comes down to the maps. See, I played a lot of the network test, about as much as I possibly could across the 12 hours it was up in the few days that it was live. And after playing that much of the network test, I became really sick of the Limvale map. It felt very static, and it was weird to get this game on day one and play again, and the first map is that map, something I was already sick of. And so when I beat the first expedition, I was very glad to move on to the second map. The Kaled map, the Liurnia map, whatever it may be. Unfortunately, the map I found was a shifting earth magma variant of the same first Limvale map. And so I struggled on and beat that expedition as well, still hoping to find new scenery on the horizon. Unfortunately, my next expedition was still Limvale. Anyway, you get the bit. Am I the only person who thought that there was going to be like 8 different maps corresponding to the different locations throughout Elden Ring? Like, I get that the balance of the Fortnite Island storm circle mechanic must have been hard to nail down, but I really expected some more variation. Like 2 days in and I'm already fucking sick of Limvale, and the roguelike elements just do not put a dent in that. What variation we do get on this base map all comes down to the shifting earth mechanic, where a section of the map turns into a different biome. Those biomes being a magma crater in the center, an icy mountain at the top, a scarlet rot swamp at the bottom right, and a mysterious castle on the bottom left. I think the magma one is kind of just annoying. It's putting a big hole in the center of the map is kind of a pain in the ass. And the icy mountain one is too far out of the way, but the rewards you get for beating the dragons there are really good, and so it's hard not to do. The castle I haven't explored much, but it seems kind of empty from what I could see. Apparently there's a weapon duplication system somewhere in there. I never found it yet. But hands down my favorite one is the Scarlet Rot Swamp, of all things. And that's because the mechanic is very straightforward here. You have a marker on your map that once you go to, you get the location of an item that will give you your power for this area. The forest power or something like that. Which makes you immune to Scarlet Rot, gives you a health bonus, and gives you the rally system with your health from Bloodborne. And if that wasn't enough reason to come here already, the Scarlet Rot Swamp is filled to the brim with bosses, and they're all pretty easy to get to. And so throughout the second night of your expedition, you'll end up with a ton of high-level drops if you can clear a bunch of the bosses there. And that is kind of a problem, because these variations to the base map were supposed to add something interesting and sporadic and random to your gameplay experience. But unfortunately for at least 2 of them, they're so valuable that you'll never really want to not do them. Especially when you consider that the final circle where you'll fight the final Night 2 boss is always going to spawn in that shifting earth area. And so to give yourself the most time possible while the storm is closing in, you're going to want to position yourself where you know the circle is going to end. And if that's always in the shifting earth, then the shifting earth expeditions will always play out mostly the same. On the Snowy Ice Cap one, you're always going to want to take out the lesser dragon at the bottom so you can get its runes as well as pick up its guaranteed boost to dragon damage buff, which will help you along the bigger dragon fight at the top of the mountain. Then you're going to want to go past that dragon and collect the power at the top of the mountain, because this power reduces your amount of frostbite taken, which is a huge boon in this fight. If you can manage to do all of that, you'll be left with an assortment of buffs from your various fights, tons of levels from high-level fights, a bonus to ice damage, and likely a legendary weapon that dropped from the dragon itself, all while positioning you right next to the end zone. It's almost undebatable that this would be the hands-down best approach to the shifting Earth expeditions. And so the random map changes, which are supposed to bring some variation, are contradicted by their overall increased value, which standardizes and sterilizes a run. However, there's one other switch up to the map formula that comes in the form of boss raids, which can be pretty interesting. Most seem to have a pass or fail situation, where if you fail, you are punished, but if you pass, you get runes for defeating a boss fight, as well as a unique buff. If you fail the Fell Omen raid, he'll increase your damage taken, but if you pass, I believe he gives you a bonus to your health bar. The Augur traps you in a bubble, and if you pass, it makes it so that your flasks give you a moderate amount of HP every time you drink from them. Failing is just the storm overtaking the bubble, at which point you're stuck in storm and you've been trapped in a bubble doing nothing. The Sentient Pest will send explosive bugs at you that will eat your levels. However, you can vaguely see the bugs and track them down to their location, at which point you'll find the pest and be able to kill it. Succeeding in this gives you a buff where you'll randomly get drops of large amounts of runes while hitting enemies. And this is how I ended up with 200,000 bonus runes past max level. This buff is really pretty overpowered. And the Libra raid will take a chunk of your health and offer you a deal to buy it back for 35,000 runes, or you can otherwise just attack it and kill Libra, which will provide you with a buff where the amount of runes you're carrying increase the amount of damage you deal. These switch-ups to the formula are challenging and fun, and can sometimes catch you at bad times, which is unfortunate, but also just part of the game. You're not always going to have RNG on your side, but outside of those situations, these events give decent rewards or harsh punishments, and I think that is probably the most successful roguelike element that's introduced in the game. Now I'm going to round out this video with a couple bits and pieces things that I haven't really touched on so far. Starting with the characters, which I haven't played all that much with. I mostly just mained the Sekiro character because he's fucking rad, but that's kind of the point I wanted to get at. I think the characters do a really good job, not because you're going to play them all and you're going to see the value in each one, but there is certainly going to be one that fits the build you like, and past that point there's not a lot of reason to switch, outside of cheesing the Augur with ranged attacks from one of the ranged characters. But outside of that, there's definitely going to be a character you like, and for me, that was definitely Sekiro. I really like the way that they played his parries, making them a toggleable thing, and making it very unintuitive at first, and something that you've got to get the hang of, otherwise you won't be successful in it. He's got a very large learning curve, but after that point, you've got a lot of moves at your disposal that you can use to take on different challenges. Now, one of the last bits of gameplay that you can get out of this game are the Remembrance quests, which each character has, which will take you throughout the round table, learning lore, and then eventually into an expedition where you'll have to retrieve an item or complete a task. These missions are a cool formula change-up, and they're usually out of the way enough that they are kind of a little bit of a challenge run. You're going to have to spend some of your finite time on completing that objective, and usually go pretty far out of your way. And at least for the Sekiro character, it ended with a pretty cool boss fight with myself, where we both just ended up pairing each other over and over again. And once you complete the entire quest, you'll be rewarded, at least in this case, with a skin, with basically nothing changed from the base skin. This might be spoilers for this character's storyline, but the skin for this character is just a seppuku mark in his armor. It's pretty disappointing when there are extravagant skins in the game otherwise. Although the skins themselves have a pretty fucking annoying implementation, I managed to get 36,000 merc before finishing the Night Lord fight and finishing the game, and I bought myself the Darkness skin, without realizing that the second you beat the game, you unlock all of the fun Dark Souls skins for your characters that you can purchase for 7,000 merc. I probably wouldn't have invested in the expensive simplistic skin if I knew that the meme skins were just one fight away, but whatever. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about this game. It's a fun little experiment. You know how experiments cost $40 and use all of the assets from a game that sold 30 million copies and generated shitloads of revenue, enough to potentially hire a new department of mod-tier developers and pump slop into a willing audience? No. I said I wasn't going to bring that up. But you know what? I absolutely stand by the opinion that I shared in my last Nightreign video, that this should have been a free expansion to Shadow of the Erd Tree. That way, Casual players who are put off by the trash scaling and artificial difficulty of Shadow's content would have a reason to purchase it, and more veteran players wouldn't have to fork over $40 for a copy-paste co-op game on the off chance that it supplies a reasonable challenge. Alongside that, if the game launched from Elden Ring's menus as an expansion of content, it would be able to use the assets of the base game without multiple instances of downloading separate games with redundant asset overlap. Plus, the goodwill generated by a generous sales model like that would be priceless in FromSoft's current tumultuous state. Serious L that nobody at FromSoft thought of that, or that it was thought up and rejected by someone with their head up their ass in the name of profits. Anyway, at the end of the day, I still think that Elden Ring Nightreign is mod slop. But I'm not above indulging in some slop every now and then. Need I remind you that I thoroughly enjoyed Starfield up until its god-awful DLC. So you know what, Nightfarers? I say, slop on. I didn't hate Nightreign, I think it's pretty fun. For now. Maybe I'll never play it again after the first week or so, but for now, I'll see you in the slop.